My mother emptied my savings account while I was at work. She'd been planning it for 3 weeks. I found out on a Tuesday morning in October, standing in a pharmacy on my lunch break, when my debit card was declined for a $14 prescription. I checked my banking app in the parking lot. My savings account, which had contained $26,000 built across 4 years of careful, deliberate saving, showed a balance of $211. My checking account, which I used for daily expenses, had been partially cleared as well. The transfers had been processed 3 days earlier. I had not authorized them. I had not been notified of them. I stood in a pharmacy parking lot on a Tuesday in October, looking at my phone, and I understood, with the specific clarity of a thing you already knew somewhere beneath conscious thought, exactly what had happened and who had done it. My name is Camille Reston. I am 29 years old. I work as a project coordinator for a civil engineering firm, a job I have held for 4 years and that I obtained through a combination of a degree I paid for myself and a willingness to start at a lower level than my qualifications merited and work my way toward what I wanted. I live alone in a 1-bedroom apartment in the city, 40 minutes from the suburb where I grew up, and I have, for the past 4 years, maintained the 40-minute distance as a matter of deliberate self-preservation in a way that I understood clearly but had never quite said aloud. I am telling you this story because I think it needs to be told, and because the specific way it unfolded contains things that other people might need to hear, and because staying quiet about it would mean letting a version of events exist in the world that is not the accurate one. Let me start with my sister Brooke, because in the family's telling of this story, Brooke is the reason everything happened. And in that narrow sense, they are not wrong. Brooke is 3 years younger than me, which makes her 26, and she has been 3 years younger than me in every sense that phrase can carry, since we were children, sharing a house on Delmore Street in Kenwick, which is to say, she arrived in the world behind me and has been trying to close the gap by other means ever since. This is not a charitable way to describe a sibling, and I want to be honest about the fact that it isn't charitable, because the whole of this account rests on my trying to be accurate rather than self-serving. And accuracy requires me to say that Brooke and I have always had a relationship that was shaped more by competition than by closeness, and that this competition was, in the particular way of family dynamics that are not examined and therefore not corrected, encouraged rather than addressed by the adults around us. Brooke is what people mean when they describe someone as effortlessly charming. Except that nothing about it is effortless. She works at it with the sustained application of someone who has identified a skill and developed it deliberately. And what she has developed is the ability to make whoever she is talking to feel simultaneously selected and necessary. The way certain people can make you feel that your attention is the specific thing they were waiting for, and that without it, something important would be missing. This works well in social situations, and in first impressions, and in the early stages of things. And it works less well across the sustained duration of an actual relationship, where the selectedness wears off and the necessity starts to feel like burden rather than honor, and where the people who've given what was asked of them discover that what they gave didn't solve the underlying problem, only delayed it. Brooke ran up a debt of $28,000 over approximately 18 months, in the way that people run up debt when they have confused the temporary availability of credit with actual resources. It began with a small online business she had started selling customized homewares, which was a legitimate enterprise and showed real promise in its first 6 months, and which then encountered the specific difficulty that entrepreneurial ventures encounter when the person running them is better at the idea of the enterprise than at the financial discipline required to sustain it. She extended her inventory credit. She borrowed against expected revenue that didn't materialize on the expected schedule. She used a personal credit card to cover a gap that she fully intended to close the following month, and then used a second card to cover the first. And the following month arrived, and the gap had widened rather than closed. The business folded 14 months after it started and left behind it a financial situation that, by the time the full accounting was available, amounted to approximately $28,000 distributed across 3 credit cards, a small business loan, and a personal loan from a friend who had since stopped being a friend for related reasons. I want to be clear that I knew some of this, and not all of it, in real time, because Brooke disclosed information in the way she always had, which was in the versions most useful to her in the moment, and the version most useful in the early months of the debt's existence was the version where everything was manageable and the situation was temporary and under control. I knew the business had closed. I knew there were some financial pressures. I did not know the full number until my mother told me, and my mother told me in the context of telling me what she wanted me to do about it. My mother, Diane, is 54 years old and has been the organizing principle of our family in the way that certain women become organizing principles, not by explicit decision, but by gradual accretion, through being the one who manages the family's emotional weather, and therefore acquiring, over time, a kind of authority that is presented as care and functions as control. She loves her daughters. I want to say this clearly and mean it, because it is true, and because understanding what happened requires understanding that what Diane did was done in the name of love, which is the specific category of harm that is hardest to name and hardest to recover from, because the person doing it believes and can credibly claim that the intention was good. The intention being good does not make the act good. These are different things. I have had to hold both of them simultaneously for a long time. Diane called me on a Saturday in July, 3 months before the pharmacy parking lot. She asked if she could come over, and I said yes, and she arrived with a casserole dish covered in foil, which was how she arrived when she had something to say that she wanted delivered with the full domestic weight of maternal care. The food as an advance on the goodwill she expected to need. We sat at my kitchen table, and she told me about Brooke's situation. The number, the structure of the debt, the interest rates on the credit cards, which she had evidently researched. She presented this information with the fluency of someone who has rehearsed it, who has sat with the material long enough to know how to move through it without losing her momentum, which told me that this conversation had been planned for considerably longer than the day she was having it. Then she told me what she wanted. She wanted me to pay off Brooke's debt, the full amount. She had calculated, she said, that $28,000 was approximately what I had saved, and that I was young and earning well, and could rebuild my savings in a few years, and that this was what families did for each other when the circumstances required it. She used that construction specifically. What families do. As though paying your sister's debt from your own savings account was a category of action that belonged in the same register as bringing soup when someone was sick, or sitting with someone at a funeral. I said no. I want to explain this refusal carefully, because in the version of events my mother has told other people, the refusal is the original wrong from which everything else followed. And I think it's important to be precise about what I was refusing and why. I had $26,000 in savings at that point, not 28. And this was a relevant detail because it meant that what was being asked was not simply a transfer of a sum I happened to have available, but the entirety of what I had built across 4 years, plus an additional $2,000 that would require me to take on debt of my own. These 4 years of saving had not been easy years. I had started my job at a salary that was lower than my qualifications merited, as I've said. And I had accepted this because I wanted the experience and the trajectory, and because I understood that starting points are not permanent. I had lived carefully. I had not taken vacations I could not afford. I had cooked at home when eating out was more appealing. I had driven a car for 3 years past the point where it was sensible to drive it, because the alternative was a car payment I didn't want to take on while I was building the cushion. Every dollar in that account was a deliberate decision, not an accident of surplus, and the $26,000 in total represented something more than its face value, which was the specific security of knowing that if something went wrong, job loss, health issue, any of the things that go wrong in a life, I would not be immediately in crisis. I was also aware, in ways my mother either did not know or chose not to name, that Brooke's $28,000 of debt had not arisen from a medical emergency or an unavoidable catastrophe, but from a series of choices that Brooke had made and continued making after the first signs of trouble appeared. I had watched the business from a certain distance. I had offered once to look at the numbers with her, and Brooke had declined in the pleasant way she declined things that might produce an honest assessment of her situation, the way of someone who is not ready to hear what the honest assessment will say. I was not unsympathetic to the difficulty Brooke was in. I was clear-eyed about how she had arrived there, and I was not willing to empty my savings account to make the consequences of her choices go away, while she retained the lifestyle those choices had been aimed at maintaining. I said all of this to my mother, or some version of it, in the way that you say things to your mother that you have been thinking about for years and that you have edited heavily before saying. I said I was sorry about Brooke's situation and that I cared about her and that there were things I could do. I offered to help Brooke make a debt management plan, to identify a financial counselor, to be available for the process of working through it in a practical way. I said the one thing I was not willing to do was hand over my savings. And I said this as gently as I could, which was not gently enough for my mother, who sat across my kitchen table and looked at me with an expression I recognized as the specific expression she wore when she had concluded that I was being selfish, and that the fact of my selfishness was both a disappointment and a useful piece of information. She left without the conversation she had come for, which meant she left with the casserole still on my counter and with a new version of the family narrative beginning to form. The version in which Camille had the money to help her sister and chose not to, which is the version that was then distributed across the next few weeks through the family network, through calls and texts, and the particular kind of information sharing that families do when they want a certain picture of events to be the established one before any alternative picture can gain traction. My aunt called, my mother's sister, a woman named Roberta, who has always occupied the position of family consensus enforcer, the person deployed to express the view that has been determined to be the correct one, and to deliver it with the authority of someone who is not directly involved, and therefore objective. Roberta said she understood I was in a difficult position, but that Brooke was struggling, and that this was the kind of moment when family pulled together. She said she knew I'd been working hard and had done well for myself, and that there was something important about not letting that separate you from the people you came from. I recognized this as a specific rhetorical move, the implicit suggestion that having savings was already a kind of defection, that the appropriate response to having more than those around you was to equalize, and that choosing not to equalize was a form of abandonment. I thanked Roberta for calling and said I would think about it, and got off the phone and then sat with the specific quality of anger that comes from being told that your self-sufficiency is a problem. My father called from 3 states away, where he had lived since my parents' divorce when I was 14. A fact that is relevant to understanding the family dynamics, but that is not the center of this story. He said he had heard there was a situation with Brooke and that he hoped I was thinking about it carefully. He did not tell me what to do, which was consistent with his general approach to parenthood since the divorce, which was to remain available for the conversations that did not require him to take a position. I told him I had thought about it carefully and that my position was the same. He said he understood. He sounded like he meant it. Brooke called once. This was the call I had been waiting for and dreading simultaneously, because Brooke calling directly, rather than sending family intermediaries, meant the campaign had moved into a new phase. She called on a Wednesday evening, and she did not start with the debt. She started by asking about my week, and about a work project I had mentioned the last time we'd spoken, and about whether I'd tried the restaurant she'd recommended, which was 2 months ago, and which I had in fact tried, and which I told her about. We talked for 20 minutes about things that had nothing to do with $28,000. And then Brooke said, "I'm really embarrassed about this whole situation, Cam." Her voice had the quality of someone saying something genuine in the middle of a performance, which is the specific gift she has. The ability to be actually vulnerable and instrumentally vulnerable simultaneously, so that you cannot entirely separate them. I said I knew. She said she wouldn't ask, except she really didn't know what else to do. And she wanted me to know she'd pay it back. All of it. She had a plan for how she'd pay it back. I asked her to tell me the plan. She described something that required several years of perfect execution, with no unforeseen complications, which is not a plan. It is an optimistic scenario, and I said as much, in the gentlest terms I could find. Brooke's voice changed slightly at that. The slight shift that happens when what was a conversation becomes something else. And she said she thought I might at least try to be supportive. I said I was trying to be supportive by being honest. She said she needed more than honesty right now, and that she thought I, of all people, would understand what it was like to need a hand. I said I understood what it was like to need a hand, and that I also understood what it was like to build something carefully over a long time, and to want to protect what you'd built. There was a silence. Then Brooke said, "Okay, just okay." And then she ended the call. That was in late August. In September, things went quiet in a way that was different from being resolved. My mother still called, but the calls were about ordinary things. Her garden, and a neighbour's situation, and a television programme she was watching. And Brooke's name came up only in passing. I registered the quiet and understood it as one of 2 things. Either the family had accepted my position, which seemed unlikely given how the August conversations had gone, or the quiet was a different phase of something I hadn't yet fully seen. I told myself it was probably the first thing, because I wanted it to be the first thing. This was a mistake. On a Friday in late September, I drove home to Kenwick for my mother's birthday dinner. This was a standing arrangement, annual, the kind of family occasion that you attend because you've always attended, and because not attending would carry its own consequences. The dinner was at the house on Delmore Street, the same house I'd grown up in, which my mother had retained in the divorce, and which she maintained with the particular care of someone for whom a home is an identity, rather than simply a residence. Brooke was there, and Roberta's husband Gerald, and a neighbour named Pat, who had been at every birthday dinner I could remember, and whose presence I had always found reassuring, precisely because he was not a member of our family, and therefore introduced a quality of ordinary social normalcy that the family unit alone could not sustain. The evening was pleasant in the specific way of family dinners that are pleasant on the surface because everyone has agreed, without discussion, to be pleasant on the surface. The food was good. The conversation covered the acceptable subjects. Brooke was warm with me in a way that contained nothing I could point to and describe as a performance, but that had the quality I'd learned to identify in her warmth, the quality of being aimed. Toward the end of the evening, while Roberta and Gerald were helping clear the plates, my mother touched my arm and said quietly that she hoped things would work out the way they should, and that she loved me. I said I loved her too. I drove home. I went to bed. 3 days later, on the Tuesday of the pharmacy parking lot, I discovered that $25,812 had been transferred out of my savings account in a single transaction, and that $416 had been transferred out of my checking account in a second transaction. Both transfers had been processed on the previous Saturday, the day after my mother's birthday dinner. The transactions showed an originating authorization from an account in my name. I had not been at a bank on Saturday. I had not initiated any transfer. My phone had not received any two-factor authorization requests that I had acted on. I stood in the pharmacy parking lot and I understood exactly what had happened with a speed and certainty that told me some part of my thinking had already been there, waiting for the confirmation. My mother had not emptied my account in a moment of desperation or impulse. What I discovered in the days that followed, through a combination of my bank's fraud investigation and a forensic process that I will describe, is that she had been preparing for 3 weeks. She had obtained, through means that took the investigators several days to fully establish, a notarized letter of authorization that she used at a branch of my bank in Kenwick, not my usual branch, a different one, to initiate the wire transfer on a Saturday morning. The authorization document bore my signature. I had not signed it. A handwriting analyst, retained later, confirmed that the signature was a forgery, a good one, produced by someone who had access to documents with my authentic signature and who had practiced. My mother had been co-signatory on a savings account I'd had as a teenager, a joint account that had been converted to my sole name when I turned 18, but that still showed her name in older records accessible to someone with sufficient knowledge of where to look. She had used this residual paper trail, combined with forged documents, to build a presentation credible enough that a teller at a branch 40 minutes from where I lived had processed the transfer. The teller had noted that the woman presenting the authorization was approximately 50 years old, which is consistent with my mother, and had confirmed 2 pieces of identifying information that my mother, who had access to family documents going back decades, would have been able to provide. I want to sit with this for a moment, because I think it deserves the sitting. My mother did not make a desperate last-minute decision. She did not act in a moment of panic or grief or extreme emotional pressure in a way that bypassed her ordinary judgment. She spent 3 weeks planning and preparing. She obtained or created fraudulent documents. She identified a branch where she would not be recognized. She prepared the identifying information she would need to answer verification questions. She chose a Saturday when I would be at home and unlikely to receive a bank notification that I would immediately act on. This was methodical. This was premeditated. This is the fact that took me the longest to fully absorb. Not the money, though the money was real and significant, and its loss created genuine hardship. But the 3 weeks, the planning of it, the sitting with the decision across 3 weeks and continuing forward. I called my bank from the parking lot.
I reported fraudulent transactions.
The representative took my report and told me the process, which would involve an investigation that could take 2 to 3 weeks, and that the funds might or might not be recoverable, depending on whether the receiving accounts had already been depleted. I called my sister, not Brooke, but Brooke, because I knew where the money had gone, even though I didn't have confirmation yet. The call went to voicemail. I called my mother. The call rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I drove back to my office and sat at my desk and understood, with complete and not quite real clarity, that I had just entered a situation that was going to require a quality of composure I was not certain I had. I called a friend named Sarah, who is a legal assistant and who has the practical knowledge that comes from working in a law office, combined with the emotional intelligence of someone who understood that I needed information before I needed comfort. She told me to write everything down immediately, everything I knew in sequence with times and dates. She told me to preserve all communications, texts, emails, voicemails, without responding to any of them yet. She told me that what I was describing was bank fraud and potentially identity theft, which are federal matters, and that I should contact the police non-emergency line and make a report before I did anything else with my family. She said this in the calm way of someone who understands that the appropriate response to a crisis is process rather than reaction, and I was grateful for the calm because my own was becoming unreliable. I made the police report that evening. I spoke to an officer named Delia Torres, who took my statement methodically and without the expression of discomfort that I had half expected, the expression people wear when a crime is a family matter and the naming of it creates an awkwardness between the domestic and the official. Officer Torres had no such expression. She was professional and thorough, and she told me clearly that what I was describing, if it was confirmed, constituted forgery, bank fraud, and identity theft, all of which carried criminal penalties, and that the investigation would proceed according to the evidence. She was careful to use the conditional, if confirmed, which I understood was appropriate at this stage, and which I respected. My mother called me at 9 that evening. I let the first call go to voicemail. The voicemail was brief. "Cam, it's Mum. Can you call me when you get a chance? Nothing urgent." I noted the nothing urgent with the specific attention it deserved. I let the second call go to voicemail as well, but this message was different in tone. Her voice had a slightly heightened quality, aware of something, and the message was shorter. "Just call me." I did not call. I sent a text that said I had been to the police and had filed a fraud report, and that any communication between us should be in writing until the investigation was resolved. I put the phone face down on the table and breathed. Brooke called at 10. I did not answer. Her voicemail was longer and had the specific quality of someone who has been rehearsing it. She said she knew I must be upset, and that things had happened in a way she hadn't expected, and that she wanted to explain, and that she hoped I could give her the chance to explain before I did anything that couldn't be undone. There it was. The framing of my having gone to the police as something I might undo. The suggestion that the criminal process was the reversible element in this situation, rather than the fraud itself. I want to be honest that the next 2 weeks were among the hardest of my life. Not because the investigation was uncertain, it was not. The evidence was clear, and the bank's fraud team and the police worked through it with a thoroughness that left little room for alternative explanations. But because of what the hardness was made of. It was not made of anger, though anger was present. It was made of the specific grief that comes when something you have been half knowing is fully confirmed. When the structure you have been telling yourself was solid reveals that it was not solid in the precise place you most needed it to be. My mother had planned for 3 weeks. She had sat across from me at her birthday dinner the night before she executed the fraud and told me she loved me. I turned this over repeatedly in a way that was not productive and that I could not stop doing. Because the two things, the love and the 3 weeks of planning, existed in the same person simultaneously and demanded to be reconciled. The bank's investigation confirmed the fraudulent authorization within 11 days. The wire transfer had gone to an account in Brooke's name, which had been opened specifically for this purpose. Not her usual bank, not an account she had disclosed to any of the family's creditors. A new account opened 3 weeks before the transfer, which was consistent with the 3-week preparation period and which established Brooke's involvement not as a passive recipient, but as an active participant in the planning. $22,000 of the transferred funds had been used by the time the account was frozen, distributed across Brooke's credit card balances and the personal loan, and approximately $3,800 remained in the account at the time of the freeze. The remainder, roughly $2,000, had been transferred to a second account that was still being traced. Detective Torres called me to relay these findings on a Thursday afternoon, and she also told me that the district attorney's office had reviewed the evidence and was pursuing charges. She told me this in the careful, professional language of someone delivering information that has significant personal weight to the person receiving it. Forgery, bank fraud, identity theft. Against my mother, against my sister. She asked me whether I had any questions, and I said I needed a moment, and she gave me one. I sat in my car in the parking garage of my office building and looked at the concrete pillar in front of me and thought about my mother at a bank teller's window on a Saturday morning. I have to tell you something about the conversations that followed over the next weeks, because they were strange in a way that is hard to describe without sounding like I'm making the other people in them into characters rather than the actual complicated people they were. My mother, when it became clear that the investigation had concluded and the charges were coming, called me through my Aunt Roberta, having understood that I was not accepting calls from her directly. Roberta conveyed, in the compressed way of reluctant intermediaries, that my mother wanted me to know she was sorry and that she had done what she did because she was frightened for Brooke and couldn't see another way, and that she loved me and had never wanted to hurt me. I sat with this message and did not find, in sitting with it, anything that changed the facts of what had happened or that I knew what to do with. Brooke called from a number I didn't recognize, which told me she knew I was not answering her known number, which told me she had planned this call. She cried. She cried in the way that Brooke cried when the situation was most serious, which was genuinely, fully, with the specific detail of someone who is not managing their emotion, but experiencing it. And I have never been able to entirely separate Brooke's genuine grief from her instrumental use of it, and this call was not an exception. She said she had not known how far Mom had gone, which was not true in the specific and documented sense that a new account in her name had been opened 3 weeks prior, and that the funds had been distributed across her specific debts within hours of the transfer. She said she had been so desperate she couldn't think clearly, which was perhaps truer. She said she was sorry in the particular way of someone who is sorry about the position they are in, which is different from being sorry about what they did. And I recognized the difference and received it without saying so. I did not respond with anger. I want to be clear about this because I think people who have been wronged are often expected to perform either forgiveness or fury, and I had neither available in a clean form. What I had was clarity. I told Brooke that I had tried to help her in the ways I was able to help her, and that she and Mom had decided those ways were insufficient and had taken the help they wanted instead. I told her that the investigation had found what it had found, and that I had not asked the police to find it, only to look, and that I had no control over what they found once they were looking.
I told her that I hoped whatever happened would end up being useful to her in some form,
which was the most generous, true thing I could find to say, and then I ended the call. The charges were filed 6 weeks after the initial report. My mother was charged with forgery, fraudulent use of financial information, and identity theft. Brooke was charged with receiving stolen property and conspiracy in connection with the fraud. I was not asked whether I wanted the charges filed. That decision belongs to the district attorney's office, not to the victim of the crime, which is something that is not widely understood and that became one of the more complicated elements of the family narrative that formed around these events.
The family's version, distributed as before, through Roberta and then through my father, who had been called and who had taken, as was his practice, the position of concerned observer rather than active participant, was that I had reported my own mother to the police and had chosen criminal prosecution over family resolution. This is not accurate, in the way that most distortions are not accurate, which is to say it is made of true-sounding components assembled into an untrue whole. I had reported a fraud to the police because I had been the victim of a fraud. What the police and the DA's office did with the report was not in my hands. What I can tell you is that the money was partially recovered. The bank's fraud division and the subsequent legal process retrieved approximately $19,000 of the $26,000 that had been taken, through the frozen account, through a judgment against Brooke that she will be paying for years, and through a restitution order included in my mother's eventual plea agreement. The remaining $7,000 is gone in any practical sense, absorbed into the gap between what was taken and what the legal process can recover. And I have accepted this, with the specific acceptance that comes from knowing that chasing it further would cost more in time and legal fees and sustained engagement with a process I wanted to be done with. My mother entered a plea agreement and received a suspended sentence with 3 years of probation, a significant fine, and the restitution order. The suspended sentence was the prosecutor's concession to her lack of prior criminal history and her age, and to several other factors that the legal process weighs, and that I was not asked about. I was asked once by the prosecutor's office whether I had any input on the sentencing, and I said I wanted the restitution and I wanted a probation condition that prohibited her from having access to any of my financial information or accounts. These things were included. I did not ask for incarceration. I want to be clear about this too, not because I am certain it was the right position, but because it was the honest one. I did not want my mother in prison. I wanted her to understand what she had done in a way that was registered in an official and permanent record. And I wanted the money back, and I wanted to be sure she could not do it again. Those things were achievable. The other thing was something I didn't have a clean position on, and so I didn't advocate for it. Brooke's plea agreement resulted in a fine and community service and a civil judgment in my favour for the amount received. She is making minimum payments against the judgment and will be for a very long time. What happened to my family in the aftermath of all of this is not a simple story, and I'm not going to pretend it is. My mother and I do not speak, which is not a position I set out to reach, and which I cannot currently imagine departing from. Not because of fury or a decision to punish, but because I have not yet found a way to be in a relationship with someone who spent 3 weeks planning to take what I'd built.
Someday, perhaps, I will find that way. I am not there yet, and the space between here and there is not something I am going to cross before I'm ready, just because the crossing is expected of me. My father has been more present in the aftermath than he was in the preceding years, which I have received with cautious appreciation.
He called me the week the plea agreement was finalised and said he was sorry it had come to this and that he was proud of how I'd handled it and that he wanted to be more useful to me than he had been. These things were imperfect and well meant, and I received them as such. Roberta stopped speaking to me after the plea agreement, and I have not found this to be a significant loss. Brooke and I exchanged 2 messages in the 6 months following the resolution. The first was a brief, practical communication through the civil process. The second was a text she sent me on my birthday, 3 months after the plea, that said, "I think about this every day." I sat with this message for a long time, and then I wrote back, "I know." That was all I wrote, and all I could write that was both true and kind. I want to say something about the money and what it meant, because I think the money is where people's attention tends to go in stories like this one. And I understand why, but I want to redirect it slightly. The $26,000 was real, and its loss was real, and the partial recovery of it was real, and the remaining gap is real. But the money was always a representation of something else, which is why its loss had the specific quality it had. It was 4 years of careful choices, accumulated slowly, representing a quality of agency over my own circumstances that I had built deliberately and that had not been easy to build. What my mother and Brooke took was not just the $26,000. They took the specific security that the $26,000 stood for, the knowledge that I had a cushion between me and the things that can go wrong, and the recovery of $19,000 of it does not entirely restore that knowledge, because the knowledge now includes the information that someone who knew me well enough to forge my signature and answer my security questions had used that knowledge against me, and that information does not leave once it arrives. What I've done about this practically is build new protections. I changed every account, every password, every piece of identifying information. I established account alerts for every transaction above $20. I moved my primary savings to an institution where no family member had any prior relationship. I put a credit freeze on my name. I did these things not from paranoia, but from the same practical orientation towards self-protection that led me to save money in the first place. The understanding that the world contains risks, and that the appropriate response to risk is reasonable mitigation. These are not large things. They are the ordinary things that people do when they understand that care is not self-evident. What I've done about this emotionally is more complicated and more ongoing, and I will not pretend to have it resolved. What I can tell you is that the thing I spent the most time on in the months since was not processing the anger or the grief or the sense of betrayal, though I processed all of those things. The thing I spent the most time on was understanding the difference between what I was responsible for and what I wasn't. I had refused to give my savings to my sister. This was within my rights and consistent with my honest assessment of the situation, and I stand behind it. I had gone to the police when I discovered fraud. This was the appropriate and necessary response. I had not asked for the specific outcome that followed, only for the investigation that made it possible. The consequences that arrived were consequences of my mother's and sister's choices, and they are their consequences to carry. And this is not a punishment I've inflicted, but the natural gravity of actions returning to their origin.
I know that there are people in my life and in the broader family network who hold a version of events in which I am the cold one. The one who couldn't bring herself to help her sister when it mattered. The one who reported her own mother to the police over money. This version exists, and it is not going away. And I cannot correct it in the minds of people who need it to be the accurate version. I have stopped trying. What I can do is know the accurate version myself and keep it clear in my own thinking. And carry it with the straightforwardness of someone who understands that you cannot control the stories people tell about you, but you can control whether you live in a way that confirms or contradicts them. I rebuilt my savings. Not the same savings account, not the same bank, not the same structure, but a new account in a new institution with new protections, started from the remaining $7,000 I had across checking and the recovered funds, and added to across 12 months, until it was back above $25,000. This took the same sustained discipline as the first time, the same cooking at home and maintaining an unreliable car and declining the optional purchases. And it was, in some ways, harder the second time, because I understood now, in a way I hadn't fully understood the first time, that the thing you build can be taken. This knowledge is not paralyzing, it is clarifying, in the way that most difficult knowledge is clarifying once you've absorbed it and stopped fighting it. Things can be taken, and some things cannot. The work that made the savings possible is not takeable. The discipline that built it is mine. The capacity to rebuild is mine. No fraud, however carefully planned, touches those things. I heard something last month that I've been sitting with. A friend who works in financial counseling told me that the most common precursor to family financial fraud is a period of escalating pressure in which the person who eventually commits the fraud tests the limits of the target's willingness to say no, and that the refusal itself is sometimes what precipitates the action, not because the refusal causes the fraud, but because it confirms for the person considering fraud that the ordinary channels of persuasion have been exhausted. My refusal in July was clear and firm and repeated, and my mother understood from it that asking again would not produce a different answer, and she made a different kind of decision. I do not carry this as responsibility for what she did. I carry it as information about the dynamics that produce these situations, and I hold it alongside the other information I have, which is that saying no to something wrong is never the cause of the wrongness, and that people who are looking for a reason to do what they are going to do will find one regardless. My name is Camille Reston. I have $26,000 in savings. I have a job I am good at, and a one-bedroom apartment where the rent is paid, and a car that runs adequately. I have a father who is trying, belatedly but sincerely, to be more present. I have a sister I do not speak to, and a mother I do not speak to, and a grief about this that is real and that I have decided not to perform or deny, but simply to hold, because it belongs in the picture, and leaving it out would make the picture dishonest. What I do not have is the specific kind of vulnerability that comes from believing, because it has always been true that the people around you would not do the thing they would do. This is not the same as cynicism. Cynicism is a refusal to expect anything good, which is its own form of protection and which costs you things. What I have instead is something that I've arrived at through a year of thinking about it, and that I will try to say accurately. I know now, with the knowledge that only certain experiences can give you, that love is not a guarantee, and that care is not always protection, and that the people who are supposed to want the best for you are people, which means they are capable of wanting other things more. This is not a reason to close yourself away from people. It is a reason to build your own ground to stand on, and to know where the ground is, and to protect it with the appropriate tools, and to understand that no one is going to protect it for you as reliably as you will protect it for yourself. I stood in a pharmacy parking lot in October and found out that my account was empty. The account is no longer empty. The person who emptied it is on probation and paying restitution in monthly installments and living with the specific weight of having done what she did to her daughter, which is a weight, I imagine, is considerable, and which I would not want, and which I did not give her. She gave it to herself. 3 weeks of planning. A Saturday morning. A teller at a branch 40 minutes from where I lived. The money transferred before I had any reason to check. I checked on a Tuesday when my debit card was declined for a prescription. $14. I checked and I saw what had happened, and I stood in a parking lot and I made the calls I needed to make. And then I went back to work. And then I went home, and then I started the process of putting things back together. This is what I did, and it is what I will always have done. And that is the accurate version of the story.